Section 8 of the Odyssey, Part 2 of Ghosts and Monsters. Out on the wine-dark sea, the one remaining ship sailed on, away from the land of the Sirens. As soon as their song faded away in the distance, Odysseus stopped shouting and struggling. When the sailors saw that, they jumped up and ran to untie him, pulling the wax out of their ears. "Thank you for your loyalty," Odysseus said. "You are faithful friends. Now I must tell you—" But before he could finish, a great cloud of spray erupted ahead of them, shooting into the sky. There was a thunderous crash of water breaking against rocks. The sailors gasped in terror, and Odysseus stared at the spray, with Circe's next warning echoing in his head. "If you succeed in passing the Sirens, you will reach the wandering rocks. They wreck every ship that approaches. You must avoid them, but you can only do that by facing a terrible choice." They had to avoid that violent crashing water, but the only other route was a narrow strait between two rocky peaks. How could he tell his sailors about the dangers lurking at each one? They had just saved his life by their faithfulness. Now, according to Circe, all he had to offer them was a choice of death or death. Scylla or Charybdis, a monster or a whirlpool. Scylla's lair was a cave high up in the taller rock. Every time a ship went past, her 6 long necks swooped down. Each of her 6 hungry heads snatched up one of the sailors and ate him. The ships that tried to avoid her steered close to the other rock and fell into the great whirlpool called Charybdis. That meant certain death. 3 times a day the whirlpool's greedy mouth opened up, sucking in everything around it. 3 times a day it changed direction, spewing everything up again. The force was enough to smash any ship and destroy its crew. "Steer close to Scylla's rock," Circe had said, "and row as fast as you can. Even so, you're bound to lose 6 men, but that's better than having your whole crew swallowed up by Charybdis." There was no other way. Odysseus didn't dare to tell his men the whole truth, in case they were so terrified that they stopped rowing. He told them only half. "We have to sail between those 2 rocky peaks," he said, pointing at the entrance to the narrow strait. "But we must be very careful. Do you see the fig tree growing on the smaller rock? Below that is a gigantic whirlpool. We must stay away from that." He took his sword and stood on the prow of the ship, watching the way ahead. The sailors rowed nervously, looking toward the fig tree. As they passed it, the sea underneath began to swirl and boil. A vast hole opened up in the surface of the water, sucking in everything around it. The sailors pulled on their oars, pale with terror, staying as far away from the hole as possible. And that was when Scylla struck. Her ugly heads came shooting out of the cave, darting down toward the sailors. She snatched up the 6 strongest men and hoisted them into the air. "Odysseus!" they screamed. "Save us, Odysseus!" What could he do? There was no way of reaching Scylla's cave. He had to watch his faithful companions dangling from her fangs like fish from a line. A monstrous head reared up, snaking back toward her lair, and for a short time the sailors' screams echoed horribly over the water. And then there was silence. "Row on!" said Odysseus fiercely. "Row on as fast as you can!" There was nothing else to do. As they went through the strait, Scylla and Charybdis vanished in the distance, and a new island appeared on the horizon. As they came closer, they saw that it was completely different from the horrors behind them. Streams of clear, fresh water gleamed golden on the evening light. Rich, green grassland spread inland from the shore. Across the sea came the sound of cattle lowing contentedly as they were taken in for the night. To the grieving, exhausted sailors, the island looked like paradise. They imagined themselves rowing ashore, and they could almost smell the wonderful scent of freshly roasted meat. But Odysseus remembered the words of the blind prophet, Tiresias, in the land of the dead. "When you reach the island of Thrinacia, don't let your men touch the sun god's cattle. If they hurt those cattle, your ship will be lost, and all your sailors too." Listening to the sound of the cattle across the water, he guessed that the island ahead was Thrinacia. "We mustn't land here," he said. "Tiresias warned me about this place, and so did Circe. It belongs to the sun god. We must find somewhere else to anchor." There was an uproar. "Are you made of iron?" Eurylochus said. "Do you think we can go on rowing forever? Where's the harm in landing here, just for the night? All we want is the chance to step ashore and eat one meal without tossing around on the water." The other men shouted in agreement. They insisted that Odysseus change his mind and let them spend the night on dry land. At last he nodded reluctantly. "Very well. But you must swear not to kill anything on the island, not one cow or a single sheep." The men swore a solemn oath, promising to stay close to the ship and to eat nothing except the food Circe had given them. Trusting to that oath, Odysseus let them steer the ship into a sheltered cove. They went ashore and ate a silent meal, not talking or telling jokes, but remembering their dead companions, snatched away by Scylla. They slept beside the ship, intending to go on board again as soon as it was light. But in the middle of the night, a fierce gale blew up, whipping the water into huge breakers. In the morning, there was no hope of setting sail. All they could do was drag their ship up into a cave to keep it safe from the storm. Sternly, Odysseus reminded them of their promise. "Remember, you are not to touch any of the cows or sheep on this island. They all belong to the sun, that great god whose eye sees everything." For a second time, the sailors swore to leave the animals alone. They meant it. They had plenty of bread and wine aboard the ship, and they didn't expect to be on the island for more than a few days. But then the wind changed. For a whole month, the south wind blew continuously, driving the sea against the shore. It was impossible to launch a ship. They had to stay where they were, and they began to run out of food. When their own food was gone, the sailors began to roam the island, trapping birds and catching fish. But however much they hunted, there was never enough to stop them from feeling hungry. And the hungrier they grew, the more they looked at the sun god's cattle. Odysseus saw them looking and knew there would be trouble if they didn't leave soon. But the wind was still blowing in the wrong direction, and only the gods could alter that. One morning he left his sailors on the shore and walked inland on his own. Finding a lonely, sheltered place, he prayed to all the gods on Olympus, asking for a change in the wind. He prayed so long and so earnestly that, in the end, he fell asleep. In that hidden place, out of the reach of the wind, he slept peacefully for several hours. Back on the beach, the sailors were muttering together while he slept. "We can't go on like this," Eurylochus said. "Odysseus threatens us with disaster if we touch the sun god's cattle. But what's more disastrous than starving to death? If we don't eat soon, we'll be too weak to sail away, even if the wind does change." The sailors hesitated, remembering their oath. Eurylochus argued harder to persuade them. "Let's choose the best of these cows and sacrifice them to the gods. Then we'll have plenty of meat to eat. If we get back to Ithaca afterward, we'll build a splendid temple for the sun god, to repay him for his cattle." "But we won't get home," said one of the other sailors. "Not if we kill the cattle." Eurylochus shrugged. "Wouldn't you rather drown than starve to death?" That convinced the others. As soon as he finished speaking, they rounded up the best cattle and sacrificed them ceremoniously. Then they built a fire on the beach to roast the meat. High on Mount Olympus, the gods heard the angry voice of Hyperion, the sun god. "Oh, Father Zeus!" he cried. "Odysseus's men have killed my beautiful cattle. Give me revenge. Otherwise, I'll go down to the land of the dead and shine there, leaving the world dark forever." "Peace, Hyperion, Zeus," said Zeus the cloud gatherer. "Peace, Hyperion," said Zeus the cloud gatherer. "Stay where you are, and leave those cattle murderers to me. As soon as their ship is out at sea, I will strike it with the lightning bolt and smash it to pieces." When Odysseus woke up, he started back toward the beach. He hadn't gone very far when he smelled the scent of roasting meat. He guessed what had happened, and he ran the rest of the way. "What have you done?" he shouted. "Do you think the gods are blind?" The guilty sailors hung their heads, but the harm was done. It was too late to bring the cows back to life. All they could do was wait for the gods to punish them. They were surrounded by terrifying sights. The empty cowhides hunched themselves up and crawled about on the beach. The meat that was roasting on spits bellowed over the fire, and from all sides, day and night, came the baleful lowing of ghostly cattle. For 6 days, the sailors had to live with what they had done, eating the stolen meat and waiting for the justice of the gods. On the seventh day, the south wind dropped at last. Pushing their ship into the water, they embarked as fast as they could, rowing away from the beach with all their strength. Very quickly, the island disappeared over the horizon. But they couldn't escape the anger of Zeus. When they were out in the open sea, a black cloud appeared from nowhere and settled over their ship. All around them, sunlight glinted on the water, but their ship was in darkness, overshadowed by the cloud. Then, without warning, a savage wind roared in from the west. It hit the ship like a hurricane, snapping both forestays. The mast came crashing down in a tangle of sails and rigging, breaking the helmsman's skull as he slid overboard. There was a great crack of thunder. A bolt of lightning shook the ship, and everyone was thrown into the sea. The sailors had no chance of surviving in the wild water. One by one, they were overwhelmed by the waves until their bodies floated around the ruined hull like a flock of seabirds. There would be no joyful homecoming for any of them. Their voyage was over forever. Only Odysseus managed to stay alive. As the waves tore the ship apart, he seized a leather rope and tied the mast and the keel board together. Clinging tightly to those two pieces of wood, he kept himself afloat as the hurricane drove him through the water, but he couldn't steer his makeshift raft. All night he was thrown from one wave to another, helpless as the wind blew him back towards Scylla and Charybdis. When dawn spread her rosy fingers across the sky, Odysseus was in the narrow strait again, being swept toward the two sharp rocks. The water below the fig tree was beginning to spin as Charybdis prepared to open its greedy mouth. Odysseus had no way of avoiding the whirlpool. There was only one possible chance of escape, if he was brave enough to take it. As his tiny raft reached the fig tree, he stood up and grabbed at its nearest branch, high above its head. His hand closed around it, but without a foothold, he couldn't swing himself up into the tree. All he could do was cling on by hanging by his arms. Beneath him, the water spun faster and faster. With a horrible, greedy gurgle, it opened up into a black hole that went right down into the depths of the sea. Dangling above it, Odysseus saw it swallow his raft. Then it gaped open again, waiting for him to get tired and lose his grip. Somehow he managed not to let go. Hour after hour he held on, watching the whirlpool below him, waiting for the moment when it began to spin the other way. The sun set, and as the sky grew dark, the direction of the water changed. Charybdis began to spew up everything it had swallowed. Odysseus hung on, waiting to see his raft reappear. As soon as the long timbers resurfaced, he unclenched his stiff hands and dropped into the water. For a second he was in its power, spinning wildly. Then he hauled himself onto the raft and lay flat out, slumped across the wood. Paddling furiously with both hands, he pulled himself away from the whirlpool as fast as he could, terrified that Scylla would catch sight of him. If she'd seen him, she would have snatched him up in a single mouthful. But it was almost dark, and the evening shadows hid him from her eyes. He came safely out of the perilous strait and into the open sea.